Professor Taormina on Plotinus and Epicureanism. So I'm talking about Plotinus and Skepticism, and for sure everyone will agree that Plotinus can in no way be called a skeptic. But he does use skeptical arguments, that is, arguments that are also used by skeptics and probably devised by skeptics. And he uses them to construe a certain epistemology of intellect as a reaction to certain problems that were raised by skeptics, and to which his theory of intellect, I think, is supposed to provide the solution. So at least since Brehé's edition of the Enneads, it is known that Plotinus makes use of skeptical arguments. And there are two texts here, 5.3 on the knowing hypothesis and that which is beyond, and 5.5 that the intelligibles are not outside the intellect and on the good. To put it more accurately, Plotinus develops arguments that are remarkably similar but not identical to arguments found in Sextus Empiricus. Sextus's arguments are directed against the possibility of knowledge and self-knowledge. Plotinus uses them in a dogmatic context and purports to show that knowledge is possible precisely insofar as it amounts to self-knowledge. So knowledge, properly speaking, is always self-knowledge. How to understand Plotinus's goals and concerns in using the arguments has been a matter of some scholarly controversy. Some scholars like Richard Wallis, Dominic O'Mara and Wilfried Kuhn argue that Plotinus addresses skeptical concerns and endeavors to refute skepticisms. Whereas others like Riccardo Chiaradonna, Sara Magrin and Mauro Bonazzi claim that Plotinus never perceived skepticism as posing a serious threat. Plotinus' use of skeptical arguments is merely part of a broader dialectical strategy in which skeptics are not the real target. Magrin, for instance, claims that the Gnostics are the real target, whereas Bonazzi argues for an inner school target, namely Longinus. This debate is linked to an important issue, another issue, namely the question whether the arguments presuppose a representationalist account of perception, combined with the question whether Plotinus himself tends towards representationalism, or rather espouses some kind of direct realism, as Emerson and Chiaradonna argue. For the present talk, I'm not interested in the broader context of Plotinus' strategy, except insofar as it is needed to understand the meaning and structure of the arguments. It's the arguments themselves that I would like to look at in order to see on what assumptions they rest. But before I do so, I want to mention another use of skepticism highlighted by Dominic O'Mara. O'Mara shows that Plotinus uses skeptical speech rules, skeptical discourse, in order to explain how we should speak about the ineffable one. This means that Plotinus transfers skeptic figures of speech from things that are real but which we cannot know to an entity that Plotinus thinks is real, in fact much more real than the things we ordinary humans usually call real, the one, but about which no direct knowledge is possible. So this is an interesting subject, but I won't talk about it, but just to signal that it's there. So I will look at two texts, and let's start with the arguments on self-knowledge in 5.3, 49 in the chronological order, which means that it's actually later than the other text, 5.5. As is clear from the way his essay is set up, Plotinus does not really worry that the possibility of self-knowledge may be an illusion. Plotinus is convinced that self-knowledge is possible, and moreover he knows where to situate it in intellect. That is why where self-knowledge in the proper sense is to be found in the separate intellect. Derivative or secondary forms of self-knowledge that are less perfect and only self-knowledge in a qualified sense occur in the discursive thinking of the soul, and also in the so-called intellect of the soul, which is different from the intellect in itself. So it's clear Plotinus comes to the argument with a preconceived idea about the nature and structure of the soul and intellect, and that he doesn't really question. So it's in no way skeptic in that sense. He starts from the fact, or from the perceived fact, that there is self-knowledge. The real question is, how do we have to understand self-knowledge, which he also formulates as, how is it possible that there is self-knowledge, in an almost Kantian manner? This question is immediately linked to the distinction between the simple and the complex. And we start now with the handout, text number 1. Does that which thinks itself have to be complex in order that it may, with one of its parts, contemplate the rest, and so be said to know itself? On the supposition that the absolutely simple would not be able to return to itself and the intellectual grasp of itself? Or is it possible for that which is not composite also to have an intellectual awareness of itself? As you may already suspect, knowing, if you know a bit of Plotinus, on the supposition that introduces a reductio ad absurdum. Because it's actually what he wants to prove, that self-knowledge is of something simple. So the way the question is introduced anticipates the argument paralleled in Sextus Empiricus, and to which I will turn only at the end of the first part. So although it starts from self-knowledge as a given, it implicitly voices a concern proper to Sextus's argument. Self-knowledge is associated with, and therefore implicitly portrayed as a form of reversion upon oneself, and the question is asked whether that is possible for something composite. The way this is done is that one part contemplates, reverts on the others. The alternative solution, in case this won't work, and indeed it won't, is that something simple is able to know itself. But another issue not adumbrated here is that if the latter would work, the composite could also revert upon itself in a different way, namely in the same way as the simple, the whole upon the whole, and each of its parts, whether actual or potential parts, upon itself. But that's not an issue that he deals with. Although Plotinus does not use the word nous here, the verbal forms of noein are unmistakable signs that he's talking about intellect. But it's not so clear what he means for something to know something with a part of itself. This is how he explains it, texts 2 and 3. For that which is said to think itself because it is composite, just because it thinks the rest with one of its constituents, as in sense perception we might grasp our own shape and the rest of our bodily nature, would not have true self-intellection. And it immediately continues, for it would not be the whole which was known in these circumstances, if that thing which thought the others, which were with it, did not also think itself. And this will be, not what we are looking for, a thing which thinks itself, but one thing thinking another. Text 2 explains what it means that something can know something in casu itself by a part of it knowing it. Something like this happens when we see ourselves, presumably in a reflecting surface, or by directly looking at our bodies, or by using another of our senses when we hear ourselves, for instance. The problem, obviously, is that what we see, or otherwise perceive, is not the whole. We will come back to this problem later. Wilfried Kuhn explains knowing by something, in case by a part of oneself, by appealing to the image of the messenger. The part that is messenger knows and announces what it knows to the whole, which is the knower. So part of myself knows something about the whole and then tells the whole what it knows. For this might be inspired by the fact that Plotinus at the end of chapter 3 calls perception a messenger, angelos, but it's not clear to me that this is indeed what Plotinus means. Possibly the knowing part is, as it were, the representative of the whole, so that the whole may be said to know in virtue of the fact that this representative knows. Or to use a less flowery language, we could think that the part is in some sense identical with the whole, in the sense that the part is not different from the whole, except for the fact that it doesn't cover all of the whole. So that it is identical with the whole in this sense, so that the part knowing counts as the whole knowing. There's nothing in Plotinus' text that contains anything about a message being spread. This is, however, not what the argument is about. The argument is rather that when a part knows all the rest, what it knows is not the whole, since itself is excluded from the objects known, text 3. The argument is actually more complex, as we will see shortly, but let us for now assume its outcome and accept that composites cannot have self-knowledge in the manner specified, or not at all. Then, Plotinus says, we have to posit that it is possible for something simple to know itself, because it would be too high a price to give up on the idea of self-knowledge altogether. Text 4. One must then assume that a simple thing thinks itself, and investigate as far as possible how it does so, or else one must abandon the opinion that anything really thinks itself. Now, to abandon this opinion is not very possible, since many absurdities follow from its abandonment. Self-knowledge is here called a belief, a doxa, that must be preserved. In the following chapters, Plotinus then examines imperfect forms of self-knowledge in perception, in discursive soul, also in the intellect of soul, but then turns to intellect where true self-knowledge will be found. That's in chapter 4. And we now turn to chapter 4. This true self-knowledge is what he denotes with the expression itself, with ellipsis of the verb to know. Text 5, if we are to know what self-knowledge, so itself, in intellect means. So the translations are not my own, they're just Armstrong, so they could contain imprecisions that I haven't spotted because I only looked at the Greek while writing this. Now, Plotinus returns to the argument adumbrated in the introduction. Does he then see himself with another part of himself? But in this way, one would be the seer and the other the seen. But this is not self-knowledge. Now, the argument appears to be slightly different from what we had at the beginning in chapter 1. Not only does Plotinus here explicitly refer to parts, he didn't use the word meros in the first chapter, but also the problem is stated differently. For neither the knower nor the known are the whole. But self-knowledge should be the whole knowing the whole. And there seems to be a further problem. The knower is different from the known in the sense that they are external to one another. So there are three possible problems. So it's not the proper object, it's not the proper subject, or there is difference, hence externality. And it's not so clear which of the three he is, prima facie not so clear which of the three he's addressing. Then he dialectically offers and rejects a solution. If the whole is homogeneous, one part knowing the other would not be a problem, for it would know what, i.e. of what character it itself is. For if the whole is homoeomeric, he also says uden diafere, if there's no difference, there would be no qualitative differences. I use qualitative not in the technical Aristotelian sense here. Plotinus responds that in this case it is not clear how a division in intellect would come about. So if the intellect would be homogeneous, homoeomeric, why would one part assume the role of the knower, the other part, and where would these parts come from? Any division would be arbitrary. So far, the discussion suggests that the epistemic problem in question consists in knowing what the known is qualitatively, which would then allow the knower to know what he or it himself is qualitatively, since they are homoeomeric. Now, a further problem with this picture is that it is not clear how the knowing part is supposed to know that it is homoeomeric with the part known. It should know this if it is to make the correct inference regarding itself, if indeed self-knowledge can rest on inference at all. However, knowing what it is qualitatively does not seem to be the most pressing problem. In my view, the difference between this problem and the next corresponds to a distinction Plotinus made in the preceding chapter, text 7. But does it not know what this is itself when it knows what kind of thing it is and what kind of things its works are? In order for the knower to know itself, it is necessary that it knows not merely something like itself, and thereby also what itself is like, but it also has to know itself so as to be able to say what it is, i.e. to identify itself and to say what it is essentially. In order for it to do that, it has to know itself as a knower. That is, it has to know that it is itself that knows, and it has to be a self-knower. That is, it has to know that it is itself the thing known by itself. Text 8. Then how will the contemplator know himself in the contemplated when he has set himself on the contemplating side? For the contemplating is not in the contemplated. Knowing himself in this way, he will know himself as contemplated but not as contemplating, so that he will not know himself completely or as a whole. For what he saw as contemplated but not as contemplating. And so he will have been seeing another but not himself. Now one could think that it would suffice that the contemplator adds from himself the contemplating to what it already knows, the contemplated, so that the whole will be restored. But then the problem is that in order to add the part of the contemplator entails adding the objects of its contemplation, for contemplation is always of something. This was said in text 9. Or perhaps he will add from himself the one who has contemplated in order that he may have perfect knowledge of himself. But if he adds the one who has contemplated, he at the same time adds what he sees. And this risks in turn to turn into an unending helix unless one makes it a circle, which is exactly what Plotinus does. And I gave you a kind of rundown of the argument with two possible branches. So C stands for cognizer or knower, O for the object. So suppose that C knows O and they are different, then C of O, so knowledge of O, is not self-knowledge, since C is not among the objects. C is missing from O. Hence one could suggest self-knowledge to take the form C of O plus C. But since knowledge is always knowledge of objects, this amounts to self-knowledge takes the form C of O plus C of O. This is absurd. Now you could think of two ways this is absurd. First, because it leads to a regress, and I think that's the argument you find in Sextus, but not in Plotinus. Or B, an argument about tupoi that I will explain in a second. Now, since it is absurd, we need to deny the hypothesis and conclude that C is O, so that the knowledge is the object known. That's the general strategy. Plotinus then finds a solution by asking how the objects of contemplation, or knowing, are in this knowing part. The question is how the object of contemplation are in the contemplator. Either they exist as imprints or representations, tupoi. Now this word in itself does not carry any physicalist or materialist connotations, but it can do. But Plotinus used it in his own theory without having these implications. So, but in any case there will be imprints or representations, but the contemplator does not possess the contemplated objects. Or, second possibility, the contemplator does possess them, but then it already possesses and knows them prior to the purported division, so that there is no need for the division. Well, hence it is better to say that the intellect is the same as that which is intelligized. So the problem with the tupoi, that doesn't work. So it's better to say that it possesses them, which means that it is coincides with text 10. If then the things contemplated are in the contemplation, if what are in it are impressions of them, then it does not have them themselves. But if it has them themselves, it does not see them as a result of dividing itself, but it was contemplator and possessor before it divided itself. But if this is so, the contemplation must be the same as the contemplated, and intellect the same as the intelligible. So, instead of introducing a division between the known and the knower, which is how this argument started, Plotinus has shown that it is better not to have any division in parts. Text 10 ends with an allusion to Book Lambda of the Metaphysics, and Plotinus continues his argument by invoking the concept of energeia, and the idea that what is known is the act of noesis, of knowing, so noesis, and you have noesis noesios. Only if there is identity between three things now: intelligizing, noesis or noein, the intelligized and the intelligizer, will there be true self-knowledge. So the condition for self-knowledge for Plotinus is that intellect, intelligizing, and intelligized are identical, perfectly coincident. But I will not explain this because this gets us away from the original Sextian argument. What is more important is that self-knowledge at the level of intellect is true self-knowledge because it is knowledge of the whole by the whole, as he says in the next chapter, just referring back to this argument, text 11, and it thinks or knows or contemplates as a whole with the whole, not one part with another, which is again brings us back to Sextus's original argument. I'm not claiming that he knew Sextus, but just that he knew the argument that Sextus knew. A further remark Plotinus makes in this context brings us in the realm of another skeptical argument also found in Sextus. Only if the object of thought is identical with the subject of thought, that is, only if the object is not present in the subject as a typos, can there be aletheia. Text 12. Or if not the same, there will be no truth, for the one who is, and I think trying to is superfluous, the one who possesses realities will possess an impression different from the realities, and this is not truth. For truth ought not to be the truth of something else, but to be what it says. So the problem here is not so much that of the certainty that knowledge should have as its characteristic, but rather what knowledge should be about. Not about an imprint, but about the thing itself. I'll skip this remark. If the object is external to the knower, the knowledge could not be of the thing that it is supposed to know, so Plotinus appears to think. And this deficiency then translates in terms of uncertainty. Text 13, necessity is in the intellect, persuasion in the soul. So, in his own theory, Plotinus denies that knowledge is a relation between two different things, as was suggested in T6, where the argument really started. So it's not a relation in the sense of being a relation between two different things, but of course if you are willing to call identity a relation, it is a relation in that sense. This also sheds some light on Plotinus's equation of intellect with being, for being too is analyzable in terms of identity with itself. Now, the next text gives you the argument as you find it in Sextus, which is somewhat different. And I should also say the way the text is split up in paragraphs is somewhat misleading because it doesn't really represent the structure of the argument. So let's read this text quickly. How much time? Yeah. Next, we have to show that the intellect is not cognizant of itself, as the dogmatic philosophers claim, for if the mind apprehends itself, either it as a whole will apprehend itself, or it will do so not as a whole, but employing for the purpose a part of itself. You see this same dichotomy at the beginning. Then the first leg of the dilemma. Now, it will not be able as a whole to apprehend itself, for if as a whole it apprehends itself, it will be as a whole apprehension and apprehending, and the apprehending subject being the whole, the apprehended object will no longer be anything. So the idea seems to be if the apprehending is already the whole, there's nothing left. But it is a thing most irrational that the apprehending subject should exist while the object of the apprehension does not exist. Nor, and this is the second leg of the dilemma, in fact, can the mind employ for this purpose a part of itself? For how does the part itself apprehend itself? So, and here I think in order to understand the argument, he makes the same kind of implicit argument as Plotinus does. Namely, if the part already knows all the rest, the nous still needs to be, so the knowing thing still needs to be included. And then the following is understandable. So how does the part itself apprehend itself? So this has to be added. This is this prosthesis about which Plotinus talked. If as a whole, the object sought will be nothing. Will be, so if the part can know itself as a whole, then of course we didn't need the entire argument, because then we could start from the beginning just saying the intellect knows itself as a whole. While if with a part, how will that part in turn discern itself, and so on to infinity? And so this is why in this short scheme I put on the 4b, 4a, because it leads to an endless regress, which is where Plotinus' argument differs and goes a different way. So we find the same dichotomy, the whole by the whole, one part by another part. Sextus denies the option that the whole knows the whole. For if the whole cognizes, the object needs to be other, and hence will be nothing, since there's nothing left. And this he does, so denying this, Plotinus did this by maintaining the radically changing the nature of the epistemic relation, because he said we have to get rid of this. So Plotinus opts for the version the whole by the whole, but denies that we have to see it as a relation of two different things, which is a step that Sextus is not making, or unwilling to make, or not considering. The other option that the part knows the part is argued along similar lines. Sextus appears to understand that if the part knows everything else, knowledge of itself will need to be added. But then the rest of the argument is different, because unlike Plotinus, he goes for this regress argument. The other text that contains a striking parallel with passages in Sextus Empiricus comes earlier in the chronological order. The first part of the Porphyrian title of 5.5, that the intelligibles are not outside the intellect, accurately reflects the argument of the first part of the essay. So people have said this is, since this is part of the so-called anti-Gnostic Großschrift, this is an anti-Gnostic argument, but it's not so clear whether there was really an anti-Gnostic Großschrift at all. So I will leave this question open. But in any case, it is unlikely that it was directed at contemporary skeptics. Indeed, skepticism was not felt to be a threat. That, however, does not mean that Plotinus considered the skeptic argument irrelevant. I think he took it to be important as a dialectical position that urges him to clarify his epistemology in such a way that it is immune to the skeptical problem. So his argument is rather, we know that there is an intellect that never errs. What form does it need to take in order for that to be possible? Text 15. Could anyone say that intellect, the true and real intellect, will ever be in error and believe the unreal? Certainly not. For how could it still be intellect when it was being unintelligent? It must then always know and not forget anything, and its knowing must not be that of a guesser or ambiguous or like that of someone who has heard what he knows from someone else. So it must be infallible. Knowing from hearsay is not allowed. But also he says, and he continues, knowing through demonstration is not enough. So even deductive argument doesn't give us the required certainty. Why not? Because everyone knows that in deductions we make mistakes. So we try to make deductions, but what we do is actually not a deduction. But more important for our purposes is the claim that the main condition is that the objects be not external to the knower. And we have the same idea of being external as we found in 5.3. He argues this by making a comparison with sense perception, where first, the object that is cognized is external to the cognizer. Second, the object of cognition is a mere image of the thing itself. And where that, so that it is a mere image, is used as an explanation of the first, that it is external. So text 16 and 17. For there is lack of confidence even about those objects of sense perception which seem to inspire the strongest confidence in their self-evidence, whether their apparent existence may be not in the underlying realities, and tois hypokaimenos, but in the ways the sense organs are affected, and tois pathesi. And they need intellect or discursive reason to make judgments about them, which is a Platonic idea you find, for instance, in the Theaetetus. For even if, but now he makes a new step, and he agrees, so he admits, for the sake of the argument, even if it is agreed that they are in the underlying sense realities, which perception is to grasp, that which is known by sense perception is an image of the thing, eidolon, and sense perception does not apprehend the thing itself, for that remains outside. And I think you will find in these texts words like typos, eidolon, and eikon, and I think they all amount to the same. That there is an image in intellect, or in sense perception in this case. The idea that the problem is that perception passes through images, 17, even if one grants that it does not have as object affections, pathe, of the sense organs. This idea stems, of course, from these originally Hellenistic debates, I think, and it has a parallel in sexes, as you will see. Now, text 17 suggests a representationalist view of sense perception. What we perceive is not the things themselves, but mental representations of them. Now, whether Plotinus himself was committed to representationalism or not is disputed. I side with those, Chiaradonna and Emilson, who argue he does not, that he doesn't have a representationalist view. But some passages, such as this one, seem to suggest the contrary. Now, overall, the evidence against the representationalist view is too strong, I think, to accept it. But what to make then of this passage? Chiaradonna suggests that the images mentioned here are not mental entities, but rather that the expression refers to the character of images that sense-perceptible things have in relation to their true intelligible causes. So the whole sensible world is an image, as you were. So the problem is not objects of sense perception and images in our head, but rather that objects of sense perception are images of ideas. So what we perceive directly is the outer world, but that's nothing but a collection of images of forms. That's Riccardo Chiaradonna's solution. But given the way in which Plotinus here draws a connection or a comparison with a mistaken account of intellect, that interpretation may be not the most plausible. So sometimes I even disagree with Riccardo Chiaradonna. Very rarely, but here on a small point I do. So it seems to me that Plotinus does speak of images of sensible things that are different from those sensible things themselves, and that this is the reason why sense perception does provide no knowledge of the things themselves and is not a reliable source of information on them. On this reading, the brief remark on perception is representationalist, but this can be explained by the dialectical context combined with the peculiar skeptical source used by Plotinus. And we will see some parallel text later on. However, even if Plotinus mentions mental representations, nothing indicates that this would imply a subjectivist account according to which sense-perceptible properties would be nothing but their mental representations. I fully agree with Emerson and Riccardo on this point. So, but the text suggests that sense-perceptible external things have certain properties to be understood in a realist fashion, but that our senses merely perceive images of them. Plotinus uses sense perception only in order to compare it with intellection. On the wrong view of intellection is like sense perception. He even says it is sense perception and has its objects external to it. And in that case, it will not be able to truly know them. Text 18. Now, when intellect knows and knows the intelligibles, if it knows them as being other than itself, how could it make contact with them? For it is possible that it might not. So it is possible that it might not know them, or know them only when it made contact with them, and it will not always possess its knowledge. But actually, he makes... so that's the first option. How could it make contact? Second problem, but if they're going to say that the intelligibles and the intellect are linked, so that they have made contact, what does this linked mean? Then the intellections, and so that's the second problem, and then the third problem, then the intellections will be impressions, which is kind of answer to the second, and this is the real problem. The intellections will be impressions, but if this is what they are, they come to it from outside and are impacts, tupoi. But then how will the impressions be made, and what shape are things like intelligibles? So he is playing on the, let's say, the physicalist notions, connotations of tupoi, only to reject it. And intellection will be of what is external, just like sense perception. Plotinus then argues that if intellect knows intelligibles that are not identical with it, it cannot be explained how it can make contact, and so is unreliable and couldn't tell when it has grasped them. But more importantly, intellection would require tupoi that act as intermediaries. That is, they would be representations present in intellect but different from the intelligible realities themselves. So the intellection would be of something external, just like sense perception. The externality of its objects then is itself a problem, even apart from the other problems that it entails. Then there is a small remark, I will pass over it. He says, well, the objects are smaller, that would be the only distinction, which is a very strange remark, but can be explained if you look at a parallel in Plutarch. The only reason I quote this is to show that it was part of an ongoing discussion. So there was already this idea with some Platonists, not Plutarch himself, but some dialectic position he discusses, that intelligible objects would just be smaller forms of sensible, rather stupid view. But still, he quotes it. From the misguided account of intellection, Plotinus also derives a series of aporiae for the intelligibles, so for the objects, and then he returns again to what he calls the biggest problem, and that's text 21. It's the last text of Plotinus that I will read. We're almost there. And this is that intellect would be grasping mere images, not the things themselves, and therefore would be nothing but sense perception. The greatest objection is this: if on grounds that the objects of thoughts are as completely as possible outside intellect, and that intellect contemplates them as absolutely outside it, then it cannot possess the truth of them and must be deceived in everything it contemplates, for they would be the true realities. And on this supposition, it will contemplate them without possessing them, but will only get images of them in the knowledge of this sort. If then it does not possess the true reality, but only receives in itself images of the truth, it will have falsities and nothing true. If then it knows that what it has is false, it will admit that it has no part in truth. So simple ignorance. But if it does not know even this and thinks it has the truth, so double ignorance, when it has not, the falsehood will be doubled and will set it far away from the truth. This is the reason, I think, why there's no truth in the senses, only opinion. Opinion is opinion because it receives, and what it receives is different from that which receives it. So the conclusion is that the intelligibles should not be put outside intellect, and that one should not think that they are mere impressions, tupoi of them in intellect. For in that case, we will have merely fallible doxa, not aletheia. Special use of the word aletheia. Anyway. So, I will briefly look at the Sexton text, but first conclude on Plotinus. What he seems to be doing to me is the following. He argues that if intellection works through tupoi, that what it knows will be different from it, external to it, and so will be fallible and not the truth, and more importantly, will be of the wrong knowledge of the wrong objects. And his solution is, of course, in order to get rid of that, to say, well, the knowledge has to be direct. There has to be complete coincidence of knower and known, which leads him to the theory of intellect. And so you can see that his theory of intellect is partially a reply to representationalist accounts of perception, which he didn't himself share, but which gave him the arguments to say intellection or true knowledge must be different. And then also, of course, must be self-knowledge, as we saw in the first text. Now, briefly about the sexist text, point out a few things. I underlined them in the handout in the Greek. So it has the same idea. Hai aistheses will not, so ta ektos ou katalambanusi, so will not grasp things outside, but only its pathe. So that's very clearly paralleled in text 16. Then he talks about fantasia. Fantasia hoion tu pathos tes aesthesios estai. And the pathos is different from the what is ectos. But then he says later on, he fantasia esti uchi tu ectos hypokemeno alla heterotinos. So he's more, tinos is very vague, of course. Anything different. Diaferontos autu, different from it. And then the problem is, faulos klinei kai ukatato hypokemenon, so it will judge on the wrong thing. Then comes an argument where he talks about similarity. So how can it know that what it knows is similar to the thing? This is not directly paralleled in Plotinus, but I think the parallel is in this idea of homoiomere. So if the homoiomeres part is homoios to it, so it's qualitatively not different from it. And then he says at the end, the problem is someone who doesn't know Socrates but sees an image of Socrates will know the image, but not Socrates himself. So you clearly see that there are some parallels. And there are more texts of Sextus. I quoted some of them, but this I think was the one that is closest to Plotinus. Thank you very much.